I am Laila, 32 years old, and the CEO of a fast-growing FinTech company. After surviving a horrific car accident, I lay in a hospital bed with stitches across my forehead, clutching my 8-week-old son Deon. I called my mother begging for help with the baby. Over the blaring music of an airport lounge, she laughed. Your sister never has these kinds of annoying emergencies. We are heading on a Caribbean cruise with her. Hire a caregiver yourself. It is not like the family trust fund is running out. Then she hung up. She did not know I immediately called my bank and cut off the $6,500 monthly transfer that funded her luxurious lifestyle. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach your family a hard lesson about appreciation. The emergency room lights were blindingly bright, reflecting off the sterile white walls. My head throbbed with a relentless rhythm, a sharp reminder of the screeching tires and the crushing impact of the drunk driver who had T-boned my SUV just hours earlier. I held Deon tight against my chest, his small body trembling as he wailed. He was safe, but I was battered, exhausted, and terrified. The doctor, a kind woman with tired eyes, had just finished stitching a gash on my forehead. You need rest, Laila, she said softly. Do you have family who can come take the baby while we keep you for observation? I nodded, reaching for my phone with a shaking hand. I scrolled past unread emails from my board of directors and dialed my mother, Loretta. The phone rang 5 times before she finally picked up. The background noise was deafening, a mix of clinking glasses, loud laughter, and tropical music. Mom, I gasped, trying to keep my voice steady. I was in a car accident. I am at Seattle Grace Hospital. Deon is okay, but I need you to come get him. They want to keep me overnight for observation. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. The kind of sigh she always used when I disappointed her, which was often. Laila, really. I am in the middle of the airport lounge. Your father and I are about to board a flight to St. Bart's. Ebony and Spencer invited us on a luxury Caribbean cruise. Mom, I am bleeding, I pleaded, gripping the thin hospital blanket. The car is totaled. I just need you for tonight. Deon is crying and I can barely keep my eyes open. Her laughter cut through the phone, sharp and dismissive. Oh, Laila, you are always so dramatic, always needing to be the center of attention. Look at your sister Ebony. She never has these kinds of annoying emergencies. She just married a brilliant tech CEO, and now they are treating us to a first-class vacation. That is what a successful daughter does. She makes her parents proud instead of calling them with sob stories. The familiar sting of her words burned worse than the cut on my forehead. For as long as I could remember, Ebony was the golden child, the perfect daughter who could do no wrong. I was the scapegoat, the workaholic single mother who never measured up, despite building a multi-million-dollar software company from scratch. Mom, please, I whispered, the tears finally spilling over. I just need someone to hold my son. I cannot help you, Laila. Loretta snapped, her voice dripping with irritation. Your father is already at the boarding gate. Just hire a caregiver yourself. It is not like the family trust fund is running out. Pay someone to deal with it. I have a flight to catch. Do not ruin my vacation with your negativity. The line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Deon's soft whimpers. I stared at the phone, my vision blurring. The family trust fund. The myth my parents had perpetuated for years to explain their extravagant lifestyle to their friends and country club associates. The truth was, there was no trust fund left by my grandfather. He had died penniless. Every luxury car, every designer handbag, every country club membership fee had been funded by me. For 11 years since I started my first successful app, I had been depositing $6,500 into their account every single month. I had paid off their mortgage. I had funded Ebony's lavish wedding to Spencer, a man who constantly belittled my achievements. I had bought their silence and their approval, or at least I thought I had. I wiped my face, my sadness hardening into cold, clear resolve. The doctor returned carrying a clipboard. She looked at me with deep sympathy. Your mother, she asked gently. She is not coming, I replied, my voice completely steady. She has a cruise to catch. The doctor frowned, checking her notes. Laila, I am required by hospital policy to ensure the baby has a safe guardian if you are admitted. If you do not have anyone, We will have to call Child Protective Services. Do not call them, I said, sitting up, ignoring the pain shooting through my skull. I will handle it. I did not cry. I did not scream. I calmly opened the banking app on my phone. The app I had designed the platform that managed billions in assets for my clients. I navigated to my personal accounts and tapped the transfer settings. I selected the recurring $6,500 monthly deposit to Desmond and Loretta Carter. Delete. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transfer? Yes. Next, I opened the credit card management portal. The supplementary black card issued to my mother, the one she was undoubtedly using right now in the airport lounge. Deactivate card. Reason for deactivation. Cardholder no longer authorized. Confirm. I looked down at Deon sleeping peacefully against my chest. They wanted me to use the trust fund. They were about to find out exactly who funded their perfect lives. I dialed the number for a premium childcare service I used for corporate events, requesting an emergency overnight nanny. Then I called my private wealth manager. Marcus, I said when he answered, I need you to run a full financial audit on my brother-in-law Spencer. Look into his startup Apex Solutions. Find out exactly how much debt he is carrying. Consider it done, Laila, he replied immediately. Is everything okay? Everything is perfectly fine, Marcus, I said, leaning back against the pillows. I am just doing some spring cleaning, the financial kind. As the nurse came in to check my vitals, my phone buzzed with an incoming email from the bank confirming the cancellation of the transfers. The game had just changed, and they had no idea they were playing. Within 45 minutes, the door to my hospital room opened with a soft click. Beatrice, the premium overnight nanny I had requested, stepped inside. She was a professional through and through, wearing a crisp navy uniform and an expression of profound calm. I handed my son over to her capable arms. Deon settled almost immediately against her shoulder, his cries softening into gentle, exhausted sighs. I watched them for a moment, allowing myself a single deep breath of relief. I had solved the immediate problem. I always solved the problems. But the quiet was short-lived. The heavy hospital door swung open again, this time with much more force. The sharp rhythmic tap of a silver-handled cane against the linoleum floor announced her arrival before she even spoke. Grandma Ruby stood in the doorway. At 78 years old, she possessed a commanding presence that could silence a crowded room with a mere glance. She wore an immaculate tailored trench coat, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes sharp and assessing. She did not rush to my bedside with frantic tears. She did not offer empty platitudes. Grandma Ruby operated on facts and strategy. She walked straight to the side of my bed and looked down at the bandage on my forehead. You survived, she stated simply, taking the chair beside me. I survived, I confirmed, meeting her gaze. Grandma Ruby reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen a few times and held it up for me to see. It was the Carter family group chat. The screen was filled with messages sent just moments ago from the airport departure lounge. My eyes scanned the glowing text. Loretta had posted a message to the group. Laila is playing the victim again. She got into a little fender bender and expects us to drop our entire vacation just to babysit. She is such an attention seeker. Ebony had replied immediately with a laughing emoji. Tell her to put some ice on it. We have a yacht waiting. Spencer had chimed in right after. Your sister seriously needs to learn how to manage her own life. Maybe the concussion will knock some sense into her. I read the words again. They laughed. They laughed while I bled. They laughed while my son cried. They laughed while I sat in a hospital bed wondering how I was going to carry the weight of this family all by myself. The repetition of their cruelty echoed in my mind, a cold reminder of exactly who I was dealing with. I handed the phone back to my grandmother, my face a mask of absolute indifference. I am cutting them off, I said quietly. I already canceled the monthly transfers and the credit cards. Grandma Ruby did not look surprised. She placed her phone back into her purse and rested both hands on the silver handle of her cane. It took you long enough, she said, her voice completely steady. You thought I did not know, Laila. You thought I was just an old woman sitting in my mansion blind to the reality of this family. I stared at her, suddenly feeling exposed. What do you mean? She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto mine. I know about the $6,500 a month. I know about the mortgage payments. I know about the luxury cars, the designer clothes, the country club fees. I know that for the past 11 years, you have been the one funding their ridiculous facade. $735,000, Laila. $735,000 to build a mirage. You paid for their fake wealth while they treated you like dirt beneath their shoes. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I had kept that secret fiercely guarded. I thought I was protecting our family reputation. I thought I was buying their love. I thought I was buying their silence. But I had only bought their entitlement. You are the strongest person in this family. Grandma Ruby continued, her tone softening just a fraction. You built a massive financial technology company from nothing. You are a brilliant CEO. But you have a blind spot when it comes to your mother and your sister. You let them drain you because you wanted to belong to them. But you cannot buy a soul, Laila. If they do not have a soul to begin with, you cannot buy it. She was right. Every word hit me with the force of undeniable truth. I had poured my hard-earned wealth into a bottomless pit of ingratitude. Now listen to me carefully, Grandma Ruby said, her voice dropping to a serious whisper. Cutting off their money is the right move. It is the only move. But you need to be prepared for the fallout. Loretta will throw a tantrum, but she is just noisy. Ebony will cry and play the victim because that is all she knows how to do. The one you need to watch is Spencer. Spencer? I asked, furrowing my brow. He is just a failing tech bro who talks too much. Do not underestimate a mediocre white man with an inflated ego, Grandma Ruby warned sharply. Spencer hides behind his startup buzzwords and his expensive suits, but he is desperate. I have seen the way he looks at you, Laila. He does not see a sister-in-law. He looks at you and sees a bank. He looks at you and sees prey. He feels entitled to your wealth simply because he married into this family. When he realizes the money has stopped flowing, he will not just walk away. He will try to take what he believes he is owed. He will try to destroy you to get it. I absorbed her warning, feeling a new alliance forging between us. Grandma Ruby, the true matriarch of this Carter family, was choosing her side. She was choosing the granddaughter who worked instead of the ones who begged. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the impending war settling heavily in the sterile hospital room. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of their ruin. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp ping from my phone resting on the bedside table. I reached over and picked it up. It was a push notification from my banking app. High priority alert. The text on the screen illuminated the dark room. Supplementary black card declined. Location: St. Bart's, Caribbean. Attempted transaction amount $15,000. Status blocked due to unauthorized user. I looked up from the screen and met Grandma Ruby's calculating gaze. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face, ignoring the pull of my stitches. The first domino had just fallen. I stared at the notification on my screen. The $15,000 charge at Le Sereno in St. Bart's had been rejected. I held the phone up so Grandma Ruby could see the glowing text. She gave a slow, satisfied nod and folded her hands over the silver handle of her cane. We did not have to wait long. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate violently across the bedside table. The caller ID flashed a picture of my mother looking tanned and unbothered in her designer sunglasses. I swiped to answer and immediately pressed the speaker button, resting the device between Grandma Ruby and me on the hospital bed. The background noise was a symphony of elite Caribbean dining. I could hear the delicate clinking of fine crystal, the gentle lapping of ocean waves, and the hushed tones of French waiters. But cutting through all of that elegance was the shrill, panicked voice of my mother. Laila, my mother demanded, her breath coming in short, angry bursts. Call the bank right now. There is some kind of ridiculous hold on the trust fund card. I am standing in the middle of a Michelin-starred restaurant, and the waiter is looking at me like I am some sort of common criminal. Fix it. I did not answer immediately. I let the heavy silence stretch, allowing her anxiety to build. Through the speaker, I could hear the rest of the table reacting to the embarrassment. Spencer was loud and indignant. His voice carried that specific type of wealthy white male entitlement that always made my skin crawl. He was actively berating the staff. This is completely unacceptable, Spencer shouted at someone in the background. Do you know who I am? I am the CEO of a major tech startup in Seattle. You run my card again. No, wait, do not run my personal card. Run her black card again. Your machine is clearly broken and I am not paying for this establishment looking incompetent. Sir, a waiter replied in a thick French accent, remaining perfectly polite but firm. The machine is working perfectly. The issuing bank has explicitly blocked the transaction. We need an alternative form of payment for the $15,000 bill immediately. I listened to Ebony chime in, her voice trembling with the threat of social humiliation. Spencer, just give them your corporate card, she pleaded softly. We cannot cause a scene here. People are staring at us. Half of my church group follows my vacation updates on social media. I cannot have them reading about us getting bounced from a luxury resort. Absolutely not! Spencer snapped back, his voice dripping with condescension. My capital is tied up in aggressive growth phases for the company right now. I am not liquidating assets because your father forgot to call his wealth manager. Desmond, do something. My father, Desmond, the man who loved to play the patriarchal provider, cleared his throat nervously. Now let us all just calm down, he mumbled, trying to sound authoritative. I am sure it is just a fraud alert. Loretta, tell Laila to authorize the charge. She handles the administrative side of the family trust. The delusion was staggering. They were sitting halfway across the world, racking up a massive lunch bill, and they truly believed they were untouchable. They believed the magic money tree would never stop dropping golden apples into their laps. They honestly thought I was just the administrative assistant to their generational wealth. Laila, my mother, yelled into the phone again, her voice cracking with mounting hysteria. Did you hear your father? Call the bank this instant. They are threatening to call the local authorities. I am not spending my vacation explaining myself to island police. Transfer funds from the main trust account immediately. I looked at Grandma Ruby. She sat perfectly still, a silent witness to the spectacular collapse of the monster she and I had both helped create. She gave me a single slow nod. It was time. Mom, I said, my voice dropping into a register so cold and flat it surprised even me. I am not calling the bank. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The background noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the heavy static of the international call. What do you mean you are not calling the bank? Loretta hissed, venom lacing every syllable. Are you punishing us because we did not stay to hold your hand at the hospital? I told you to hire a nanny. Do not be vindictive, Laila. It is ugly. Fix the card right now. There is nothing to fix, I replied, leaning back against the hospital pillows. The card is not broken. The account is not locked for fraud. It is closed. Closed, Loretta repeated the word as if it belonged to a foreign language. You cannot close the trust fund account. You only manage it. It is family money. That is the grand illusion, is it not? I said, feeling a massive weight lifting off my chest with every word. The famous Carter Family Trust Fund. The legacy of grandfather. The endless well of money that pays for your cruises and your country clubs and your designer wardrobes. I took a deep breath and let the truth fall. There is no trust fund, Mom. There never was. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the phone. I could picture them all frozen at the table, the ocean breeze suddenly feeling very cold against their skin. Grandfather died with absolutely nothing. I continued, my words striking like physical blows. Every single dime you have spent for the last 11 years came directly from me. It came from my software company. It came from the sleepless nights and the missed meals that you all mocked me for. I am the trust fund. I am the family wealth. And as of this morning, you are all cut off. Laila, stop this nonsense! Desmond barked, his patriarchal tone slipping into something resembling absolute panic. This is not a funny joke. We are in a serious situation here. I am entirely serious, Dad, I said, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet hospital room. I funded at Ebony and Spencer throwing that lavish wedding. I paid off your mortgage. I bought the very clothes you are wearing right now. And while I was bleeding in an emergency room, you told me I was an annoyance. You told me I was ruining your vacation. Laila, please, Ebony broke through, her voice thin and reedy. Spencer is getting angry. The manager is calling the police. Just turn the card back on. We will fly back tomorrow. We promise we will come to the hospital. You can fly back whenever you want, I said, completely unbothered by her tears. But you will be flying coach. and you will be paying for it yourselves. Spencer claims to be a brilliant tech CEO. Let him figure out how to pay a $15,000 lunch bill with his aggressive growth capital. You cannot do this to us, my mother gasped. Her voice was completely stripped of its usual arrogance, leaving only naked terror. We are your family. How are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to get home? Like I told you earlier, Mom, I said, mirroring her exact words from hours ago. Do not make a big deal out of it. Just hire a financial advisor. It is not like the money is running out for me. Enjoy your Caribbean cruise. I heard a loud clatter over the speaker, followed by the distinct sound of breaking glass. My mother had dropped her phone directly onto the table, shattering a wine glass in the process. The commotion erupted immediately. The restaurant manager was demanding payment in French. Spencer was shouting obscenities, trying to intimidate the staff. Ebony was sobbing loudly, begging someone to help them. I reached forward and pressed the red button on my screen, severing the connection. The hospital room plunged back into total peace. I looked at Grandma Ruby. She was smiling a slow, dangerous smile that told me she was already calculating our next move in this beautiful war. Grandma Ruby and I sat in the quiet hospital room, letting the reality of what just happened settle around us. I had finally done it. I had severed the financial arteries that kept their fake world alive. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind of beast, and my family was entirely composed of cornered animals. The next 48 hours were a slow blur of medical checks and quiet, tender moments with my son. I focused entirely on healing my body. I focused entirely on protecting Deon. I completely ignored the endless stream of blocked calls and unread messages flooding my phone. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of the world without needing to look. Loretta, Desmond, Ebony, and Spencer had been unceremoniously kicked out of their 5-star luxury resort. Without my black card to cover their champagne breakfasts and ocean view suites, they had been forced to pack their bags in utter disgrace. They had to drain whatever meager personal funds they had left, just to secure last-minute coach tickets back to Seattle. I could only imagine the sheer humiliation they felt sitting in economy class, stripped of their fake wealth and forced to confront reality. But I severely underestimated the depths of their depravity. I thought their retaliation would come in the form of a screaming match at my front door or a barrage of nasty emails. I was completely wrong. They decided to hit me where it would cause the most catastrophic damage possible. It was the morning of my scheduled discharge. I was carefully folding my clothes into a small travel bag while Beatrice, the premium nanny, rocked Deon to sleep near the window. The hospital room door suddenly swung open with startling force. It was not a nurse coming to check my vitals or bring discharge papers. A stern woman in a stiff gray suit marched into the room holding a thick clipboard. 2 hospital security guards stood silently behind her, effectively blocking the exit. The air in the room instantly grew cold and heavy. She looked at me with eyes completely devoid of warmth or empathy. She asked if I was Laila Carter. I told her I was. She announced she was an investigator with Child Protective Services. My breath caught in my throat. My hands froze on the zipper of my bag. Child Protective Services. The words echoed in my mind like a terrifying death sentence. She stepped further into the room and told me they had received an urgent, anonymous report early that morning. The caller claimed I had sustained severe brain damage in the car crash. The caller told the state that I was acting completely erratic, suffering from violent delusions, and actively endangering my 8-week-old baby. The caller insisted I was entirely unfit to be a mother, and that Deon needed to be placed in state custody immediately for his own physical survival. The room began to spin. The white walls felt like they were rapidly closing in on me. This was not about a canceled credit card anymore. This was my sister Ebony and her white husband Spencer, using the system to terrorize me. They were angry about flying coach and being embarrassed at a restaurant, so they decided to take my child away. They wanted to rip my baby from my arms and throw him into the cold foster care system just to punish me for closing my wallet. A fiery, burning rage ignited deep in my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the monitor against the wall. I wanted to find them and tear their lives apart piece by piece. But I knew that reacting with anger was exactly what the investigator was hoping to see. Crying or shouting would only make me look like the unstable brain-damaged woman the anonymous caller described. I forced my heart rate to slow down. I pulled my shoulders back and channeled every single ounce of cold corporate composure I possessed as a chief executive officer. I did not raise my voice. I calmly asked the investigator for her full name and her state badge number. I looked her dead in the eye and told her she had been weaponized by a family of desperate con artists. I reached out and pressed the red call button for my attending physician. I told the investigator she was free to evaluate me and my child, but she would do so in the strict presence of my medical team. Within minutes, Dr. Chen walked in and immediately demanded to know what was happening in her ward. The investigator repeated the horrific allegations. Dr. Chen was absolutely furious. She pulled my thick medical chart from the end of the bed and shoved it toward the investigator. She stated with absolute medical authority that I had only suffered a minor laceration and a very mild concussion. She confirmed I was completely lucid, fully capable, and had been an exemplary mother since the moment I was brought into the emergency room bleeding. She warned the investigator that removing a child based on a malicious lie would result in a massive lawsuit against the State Department. The investigator still insisted on examining Deon. My hands trembled slightly as I stepped aside to let her look at my sleeping baby. He was clean, perfectly fed, and wrapped in a warm, soft blanket. Beatrice stepped forward and provided her own premium credentials confirming my perfect state of mind and detailing the exceptional professional care Deon was receiving. The investigator reviewed the overwhelming evidence before her. She looked at the detailed medical reports, the fierce defense from the doctor, and the professional nanny standing guard. Her stiff, aggressive posture finally deflated. She realized she had been used as a pawn in a sick, twisted family game. She apologized profusely for the unprovoked intrusion, stating the case would be closed immediately as entirely unfounded. Before she walked out the door, she warned me that whoever made that anonymous call was actively trying to destroy my life and that I needed to protect myself at all costs. The heavy door closed, leaving me alone in the silence. Grandma Ruby, who had watched the entire exchange in quiet horror, squeezed the silver handle of her cane until her knuckles turned white. The realization settled over me like a heavy, dark shroud. My parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law were not just greedy or entitled, they were evil. They wanted to strip me of my motherly rights. They wanted to see me broken, grieving, and childless, just to teach me a lesson about obedience. I picked up my phone from the table. My hands were no longer shaking. The sadness and betrayal were completely gone, leaving nothing but absolute zero calculation. I did not call my mother to scream. I did not call the police to report harassment. I scrolled through my business contacts and called my ruthless corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. I told him to drop every other case he was working on immediately. I told him my family just tried to take my newborn son. I told him it was time to move to the next phase and tear Spencer and his fake tech company straight to the ground. I hung up the phone with my lawyer, feeling the gears of my revenge beginning to turn. The hospital discharged me shortly after. The drive home was quiet. Beatrice held Deon in the back seat while I stared out the window at the passing city. When we finally arrived at my estate, I felt a profound sense of relief. The heavy iron gates closed behind us, locking the chaos of the world outside. I walked through the front doors and breathed in the familiar scent of my own home. Beatrice took Deon upstairs to the nursery for his afternoon nap. I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water. I leaned against the marble counter, letting the silence wash over me. I was finally safe, or so I thought. The heavy oak front door flew open with a violent crash that shook the walls. Aggressive footsteps marched across the hardwood floor of the foyer. They stormed into my kitchen like a pack of rabid animals. Loretta, Desmond, Ebony, and Spencer stood in my home completely uninvited. Their clothes were wrinkled from the long coach flight, and their faces were twisted with jet lag and pure rage. They did not ask about my injuries. They did not apologize for the malicious Child Protective Services investigation. They simply expected me to surrender. Desmond stepped forward first. His face was red and his chest was puffed out in a pathetic display of patriarchal authority. He pointed a thick finger at me and aggressively demanded that I reinstate his monthly stipend immediately. He told me it was his absolute right as the head of the Carter family to distribute the wealth as he saw fit. He said daughters do not cut off their fathers, and that my rebellious behavior was a massive disrespect to his name. I stared at the man who had ignored me my entire life. He was standing in a house I bought demanding money from a trust fund that I invented. Before I could tell him how delusional he sounded, Ebony pushed her way to the front. Her eyes were puffy and she began to sob hysterically. She slammed her hands on my counter and wailed about how my selfish tantrum had completely ruined her Instagram aesthetic. She cried that she had booked a private yacht photo shoot and instead had to post pictures of a commercial airport terminal. She said her elite friends were asking questions and that I had intentionally humiliated her out of pure jealousy for her perfect life. I looked at the four of them standing in my sanctuary. They had tried to rip my baby from my arms and now they were demanding my money and my submission. I set my glass down. The sharp sound silenced them. I pointed to the door and coldly ordered them to get out of my house. I told them they had exactly 60 seconds to leave my property before I called the police and had them all arrested for an unlawful home invasion. My mother gasped, and my father stepped back in shock. But it was Spencer who moved next. Spencer stepped forward, placing himself directly in front of me. He slowly adjusted the cuffs of his expensive jacket. He looked down at me and flashed a deeply arrogant, condescending smile. Spencer stepped forward, placing himself directly in front of me. He slowly adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored jacket. He looked down at me and flashed a deeply arrogant, condescending smile. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought his mere presence was enough to make me back down. "You think you are so smart, Laila," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with the kind of unearned confidence only a mediocre man failing upward could possess. "You think you can just snap your fingers and cut off your own parents. You think you can leave us stranded on a Caribbean island and face no consequences." I stood my ground in the center of my kitchen. I did not cross my arms or step back. I just looked at him. I let him talk, knowing that arrogant men always reveal their weaknesses when they think they have the upper hand. Desmond and Loretta nodded behind him like obedient servants. Ebony sniffled, wiping her perfectly powdered nose and whining about her ruined social media posts. She cried that my selfish tantrum had destroyed her curated Instagram aesthetic because she was forced to post pictures from a commercial airport terminal instead of a private yacht. Spencer paced across my custom marble floor, acting as if he owned the estate. He pointed a manicured finger at my bandaged forehead. "You have suffered a severe head trauma, Laila," he said, his tone turning mockingly clinical. "You are acting erratically. You canceled family financial accounts without warning. You are alienating your loved ones. We already had Child Protective Services visit you because of your unstable behavior. It paints a very troubling picture for a judge." I remained entirely silent, letting his desperate threats hang in the air. "Do you know what elder financial abuse is, Laila?" he asked, leaning his hands on my kitchen island. "It is a very serious crime. You have been providing for your aging parents for a decade, establishing a clear legal precedent of care. To suddenly revoke that financial support while exhibiting signs of brain injury and mental instability gives us tremendous legal leverage." He smiled again, a cold, predatory grin. "My lawyers are already drafting the paperwork," he lied smoothly. "We are going to file for an emergency medical conservatorship. The courts will look at your car accident, your erratic financial decisions, and the Child Protective Services report. They will declare you temporarily unfit to manage your own assets. And as your brother-in-law, an established tech CEO myself, the court will naturally appoint me to oversee your estate and your financial technology company until you recover." The sheer audacity of his threat was almost breathtaking. He was standing in my house, a house paid for by my brilliance, and threatening to use a biased legal system to steal my life work. He genuinely believed that a judge would look at a highly successful black woman and a mediocre white man and instinctively hand him the keys to her empire. He leaned entirely on his privilege, assuming the system would automatically bend to his will. He thought my silence was fear. He thought my lack of reaction meant he had won. I looked at Spencer. I looked at the slight tremor in his hands and the bead of sweat forming at his hairline. He was not a conqueror. He was a desperate drowning man trying to pull me under with him. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. Spencer blinked, his arrogant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before he recovered. "I am just trying to help you, Laila. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Turn the trust fund accounts back on, apologize to your mother and father, and we can forget this ugly little episode ever happened." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He instinctively took a half step back, proving exactly who held the real power in this room. There is no elder financial abuse when the money being revoked is a voluntary personal gift, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. My legal team anticipated this empty threat years ago. Every transfer was documented as a revocable gift. You have zero legal precedent. As for your little child protective services stunt, my attending physician and a premium licensed caregiver both submitted sworn affidavits confirming my complete physical and mental competence. The investigator closed the file before she even left the hospital floor. Spencer opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. And as for a conservatorship, I continued stepping even closer, so he was forced to look up at me slightly. "Do not ever walk into my home and threaten me with the legal system. You think because you wear a custom suit and run a failing startup that you can intimidate a Black woman who built a billion-dollar enterprise from scratch. You think your privilege is a weapon that can dismantle my reality. You are nothing but a parasite, Spencer. You married my sister because you smelled the money, and now that the money is gone, you are panicking." I saw the panic flash in his eyes, the absolute terror of being exposed. Ebony gasped loudly. "How dare you speak to my husband that way, Laila," she cried. "He is trying to save this family. He is trying to save himself, Ebony," I said, not even looking at her. Desmond stepped forward, his face red with anger, demanding his monthly stipend, as if it was his absolute patriarchal right. He yelled that daughters do not cut off their fathers. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not dial the police. The police were too unpredictable. Instead, I pressed the direct line to the private armed security force that patrolled my gated estate. "This is Laila Carter," I said into the phone, keeping my eyes locked on Spencer. "I have 4 hostile trespassers in my kitchen refusing to leave. I need a full team here immediately for physical removal." Loretta gasped, clutching Desmond by the arm. "You are calling neighborhood security on your own parents. You are a monster, Laila." "I am a homeowner removing unwanted pests," I replied coldly. Within 60 seconds, the sound of heavy boots echoed on my front porch. 4 massive security guards dressed in tactical black gear strode through the open front door. The lead guard placed his hand firmly on his utility belt and looked at me for instruction. "These 4 people are no longer welcome on my property," I said, pointing to my family. "Escort them to the gates. If they resist, call the local police and press charges for trespassing and unlawful home invasion." The guards moved in instantly. Spencer tried to puff up his chest and play the alpha male. "Do not touch me," he barked at the nearest guard. "I am a prominent tech executive. I will sue you and this entire neighborhood." The guard, easily twice his size, did not even blink. He simply grabbed Spencer by the shoulder and marched him forcefully toward the exit. Spencer stumbled, his expensive loafers slipping on the marble floor. Ebony shrieked, grabbing her designer purse and running after him, crying about how unfair the world was. Desmond and Loretta backed away, their faces pale with shock. My father tried to muster one last scrap of dignity, telling me I would regret this day and end up completely alone. "I am already alone, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "The only difference is that now I am not paying for the privilege." The guards ushered them out the door. I walked into the living room and stood by the large bay window, watching the scene unfold on my driveway. Spencer was shouting and pointing his finger at the security team while they forced him toward my property line. Ebony was sobbing onto my mother. Desmond was staring at my house with a look of pure hatred. They were a pathetic picture of entitlement stripped of its funding. I watched until the heavy iron gates closed behind them, locking them out of my world forever. The silence that filled my house was profound and beautiful. But the war was far from over. Spencer had shown his hand. He had revealed his willingness to use dirty legal tactics and his social privilege to steal my wealth. He thought a fabricated report and a bluff about a conservatorship would break me. He had no idea what a real corporate takedown looked like. I walked over to my home office and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and brought up the secure encrypted portal I used to communicate with my private wealth manager and my lead corporate attorney. Spencer had threatened my company. He had threatened my child. He had made the fatal mistake of confusing my previous generosity with weakness. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus, my ruthless corporate lawyer. He answered immediately. "Marcus," I said, leaning back in my leather chair, "I need you to accelerate the forensic financial audit on Apex Solutions. I want to know everything about Spencer and his company. I want to know who his investors are. I want to know his debt-to-income ratio. I want to know every single unpaid vendor and every vulnerable contract he holds." "I have already started digging," Laila. Marcus replied, his voice crisp and professional. "The initial numbers look terrible. He is burning through venture capital faster than he can secure it. His flagship product is delayed, and his board of directors is getting restless." "Perfect," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "I want to buy his debt. I want to quietly acquire a controlling interest in his primary supply chain. I want to own the very ground his fake empire is built on. He came into my house today and threatened to take my company. It is time I took his." Marcus did not waste a single second. Within 48 hours, the encrypted files started dropping into my secure digital inbox. I locked the door to my home office and poured myself a black coffee. I booted up the proprietary risk analysis software I had designed for my own FinTech platform and fed Spencer's corporate data straight into the algorithm. I wanted a full stealth audit. I wanted to see every hidden corner of Apex Solutions. What the software revealed was not just a failing tech startup, it was a catastrophic financial black hole. Spencer was not just struggling, he was drowning in over $12 million of toxic debt. The sleek Seattle office space, the leased luxury company, vehicles, the flashy corporate retreats, all of it was a house of cards, built entirely on predatory high-interest bridge loans. He had zero actual revenue. His flagship software, the revolutionary product he constantly bragged about at family dinners, was a glitchy, broken mess that had failed its beta testing phase 3 separate times. His lead engineers were quitting, and his board of directors was preparing to oust him. But the most horrifying truth was hidden deep in his personal banking transfers. My algorithms tracked the flow of capital directly from Apex Solutions back to his joint accounts with my sister. Spencer had quietly drained every penny of Ebony's personal savings to cover his payroll. When her savings ran out, he started surviving by siphoning off the $6,500 monthly stipend I had been sending to our parents. Loretta and Desmond were funneling my money straight to Ebony under the table, and Ebony was pouring it directly into Spencer's failing company just to keep the lights on. The realization made my blood run cold. I sat in my ergonomic chair staring at the glowing screen as the depth of their parasitism truly set in. My mother had always praised Ebony for marrying a brilliant provider. She constantly belittled my career while holding Spencer up as the pinnacle of success. Yet behind closed doors, my hard-earned money was the only thing keeping his fake billionaire lifestyle afloat. I had been inadvertently funding the very man who just threatened to steal my company and my child. He used my money to buy the custom suit he wore while standing in my kitchen trying to destroy me. I closed the financial spreadsheets and opened a new secure line. I dialed Julian, a contact of mine who ran one of the most aggressive private equity firms on the East Coast. His firm specialized in acquiring and liquidating distressed assets. Julian answered immediately, knowing I only called when there was serious capital on the table. "Julian," I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of emotion, "I need you to initiate a hostile debt consolidation. The target is a Seattle-based tech startup called Apex Solutions." I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. Julian pulled up the company profile. He whistled softly into the receiver. "This company is a sinking ship, Laila," he warned. "They are bleeding cash and carrying millions in unsecured loans. Touching this is toxic. Why do you want a dead asset? I do not want the company, Julian, I replied, staring at a photo of Spencer on his company website, looking smug and untouchable. I want his debt. I want you to use my personal capital to buy up every single promissory note, every bridge loan, and every outstanding line of credit Spencer holds. I want you to contact his creditors today and offer them a premium buyout. Consolidate all of it under a blind shell company that I completely control. There was a brief pause. Julian was a shark, and he instantly recognized blood in the water. He realized this was not a business investment. This was an execution. Buying out multiple hostile creditors at a premium to acquire this much toxic debt will cost you millions, Laila, he cautioned gently. It is a terrible financial return. The price is entirely irrelevant, I told him, resting my hands on my desk. I am not buying a return on investment. I am buying absolute leverage. I want to own the paper on his entire existence. I want to be his only creditor. Consider it done, Julian said, his voice dropping into a low professional register. I will have my team draft the acquisition contracts immediately. We will move fast and sweep the debt before he even knows his creditors have changed hands. I ended the call and leaned back, closing my eyes. The sheer audacity of my family had finally pushed me past the point of basic retaliation. They wanted to play games with Child Protective Services. They wanted to threaten my legal autonomy. They were about to learn what happens when you wage war against someone who actually controls the board. 3 days passed in total silence. My security team kept my perimeter secure. My mother tried calling from various blocked numbers, but Beatrice and I remained completely isolated in our peaceful routine with Deon. I focused on my son while my trap was quietly being set in the shadows of the financial sector. On the morning of the 4th day, my secure phone chimed. It was a message from Julian. A single encrypted document was attached. I opened the file and smiled. The buyout was fully complete. The shell company I owned was now the sole holder of $12.5 million of Apex Solutions corporate debt. I owned Spencer. I owned his company, his office, his servers, and his future. The timing was absolutely perfect. My calendar alert popped up on my secondary monitor. Spencer was scheduled to present at the largest venture capital summit in the Pacific Northwest that very morning. He was going to walk onto a stage and pitch his failing company to a room full of billionaires desperately begging for a lifeline to save his fraudulent empire. He had no idea the lifeline had already been cut. I picked up my car keys and walked out the door. I had a presentation to attend. Marcus moved with terrifying efficiency. Within 48 hours, my shell company had successfully swallowed the first massive chunk of Apex Solutions' toxic debt. Spencer was completely oblivious. He was too busy trying to keep up appearances and fighting with his board of directors to realize that the ground beneath his feet was already owned by me. But while Spencer was drowning in corporate panic, Ebony was launching a completely different kind of war. She realized very quickly that the $6,500 monthly stipend was never coming back. The credit cards were declining. The luxury car leases were threatening repossession. They were completely broke, and the desperation turned her vicious. Ebony could not fight me in a boardroom, so she decided to fight me in the only arena she actually understood. She took to social media. It started on a Tuesday morning. Ebony posted a highly edited, heavily filtered video to her hundreds of thousands of followers. She sat on her plush sofa wearing minimal makeup to look appropriately distressed and forced herself to cry perfectly timed tears. She told the camera that her family was going through an unimaginable private tragedy. She claimed that my recent car accident had left me with severe brain damage and profound psychological instability. She painted a horrifying picture of a grieving widow who had completely lost her mind and disconnected from reality. She told the world that I had turned violently against my own blood. She claimed I was maliciously hoarding resources and actively committing elder abuse against our aging parents by throwing them out into the cold without a penny to their names. She weaponized every single therapy buzzword she could find, calling me a toxic narcissist who was endangering her own newborn child. She did not stop at Instagram and TikTok. Ebony took her tearful performance straight to the congregation of their massive megachurch. My parents played their roles perfectly, sitting in the front pew, looking like devastated victims of a cruel, ungrateful daughter. My father actually stood before the congregation with his head bowed while the pastor asked everyone to pray for my troubled soul. The church community began whispering immediately. The rumors spread like wildfire through the affluent social circles of Seattle and Atlanta. People who had never even spoken to me were suddenly expressing deep concern about my mental state. My phone began to fill with messages from distant relatives and family acquaintances asking if I was seeking psychiatric help. Ebony was painting herself as the tragic, loving sister, just trying to hold a broken family together, while I was the cold, calculating villain, determined to destroy them. The smear campaign was incredibly effective. It did not take long for the malicious gossip to bleed from social media directly into the corporate sector. The financial technology world is built entirely on trust, stability, and flawless reputation. When rumors of my supposed brain damage and erratic behavior began circulating, a wave of hesitation hit my minor business partners. 3 of my secondary software vendors called my office to temporarily pause our upcoming contract renewals. A mid-level payment processing firm put a hold on a $3 million integration deal. They used careful corporate language about needing to review market conditions, but I knew exactly what was happening. They were spooked. They thought the chief executive officer of their partner company was suffering from a mental breakdown and liquidating assets at random. My public relations team was absolutely frantic. They flooded my secure inbox with crisis management strategies. Marcus called me 3 times in one afternoon, begging me to release a statement. He wanted to issue a massive cease and desist order against Ebony and Spencer. He wanted to release my pristine medical records to the press, to instantly prove she was lying about the brain damage. He warned me that ignoring a smear campaign of this magnitude could cause permanent damage to my corporate reputation and scare away future investors. I told Marcus to stand down. I explicitly forbade my public relations team from releasing any statements whatsoever. I refused to explain myself to the public. I refused to defend my sanity to people who did not matter. Reacting to Ebony was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to issue a frantic denial. She wanted a public screaming match because engaging with her would only validate her claims that I was acting erratically. A lion does not turn around when a small dog barks. Silence is the absolute ultimate weapon against a narcissist because it starves them of oxygen. I chose absolute total silence. The silence drove them absolutely crazy. Ebony posted more videos escalating her claims, but without a response from me, the drama had no fuel. Her followers started asking for proof, and she had none to give. I spent my days perfectly calm. I fed Deon his bottles. I sat in my sunroom reviewing the final acquisition papers for Spencer's remaining debt. The minor contract pauses were completely insignificant to my bottom line. My core investors knew exactly who I was, and they did not care about internet gossip. I let Ebony scream into the void while I quietly prepared the guillotine for her husband's fake tech empire. I was sitting in the nursery, rocking Deon to sleep, when my personal cell phone buzzed softly on the changing table. It was a direct call from a restricted number. There were only 3 people in the world who had access to this specific encrypted line. I carefully laid my sleeping son in his crib and walked out into the quiet hallway before answering the call. It was Grandma Ruby. Her voice was sharp and clear, carrying none of the fragile elderly weakness she usually projected around my parents. For weeks she had been my silent observer on the inside. She had stayed in the guest room of my parents' house pretending to be a frail old woman entirely dependent on their care. They thought she was just a harmless spectator. They had no idea she was the sharpest mind in our entire family. Grandma Ruby did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. She spoke in a low, steady tone that sent a thrill of anticipation straight down my spine. She told me my mother and father were completely panicked about the money running out. She told me they were drowning in unpaid bills and had just finalized a desperate plan to access the emergency family trust that they thought they still controlled. I took the bait, Laila. she whispered, her voice dripping with cold satisfaction. The game is on. Grandma Ruby had always been a master of strategy. She explained her entire plan to me over our secure line, and I listened in absolute awe of her brilliance. She knew that my parents and Ebony were entirely driven by greed. They were only attacking me because they thought I was their only source of income. Grandma Ruby decided it was time to remind them who held the real wealth in the family. Her estate was worth over $15 million, and she was ready to dangle it right in front of their desperate faces. The very next morning, Grandma Ruby set her trap. She had her private physician, a trusted family friend who owed her several favors, make a highly dramatic and very public house call to my parents' suburban home. He informed Loretta and Desmond that Ruby had suffered a sudden and catastrophic decline in her cardiac health. He told them with a gravely serious face that her heart was failing, and she only had a matter of weeks left to live. He also dropped the most important piece of bait. He casually mentioned that Ruby had requested her lawyers to come to the estate by the end of the week to completely restructure her $15 million trust. The effect was instantaneous. It was like someone flipped a switch on their artificial outrage. Ebony completely abandoned her social media smear campaign against me. She deleted the crying videos. She stopped posting Bible verses about family betrayal. She suddenly had zero interest in portraying me as an unhinged abuser because there was a much bigger prize on the table. A $6,500 monthly stipend was nothing compared to a $15 million inheritance. Loretta and Desmond entirely forgot about their patriarchal pride and their anger toward me. They packed their bags and practically sprinted out the door. Within hours, my entire family descended upon Grandma Ruby's sprawling historic mansion like a flock of starving vultures. They pushed past her actual nursing staff and immediately began playing the roles of the devoted, loving family. Loretta stood by the foot of Ruby's grand four-poster bed, weeping dramatic tears and dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Desmond paced the room, talking loudly about how he was the man of the house now and would personally oversee his mother's final days. Ebony and Spencer shoved their way to the front, holding hands and acting like the perfect, dutiful grandchildren. Spencer actually had the nerve to stroke Ruby's frail hand and promised that he would safeguard her legacy with his own business expertise. Grandma Ruby played her part flawlessly. She lay back against her mountain of plush pillows, looking appropriately weak and breathless. She coughed weakly and spoke in a raspy whisper, telling them how much she appreciated their sudden devotion. She told them she was rethinking everything in her final days. She heavily implied that whoever proved to be the most loyal and capable would be named the sole executor and primary beneficiary of her newly revised will. It was a brilliant psychological game. By hinting at a single primary beneficiary, Grandma Ruby instantly turned them against each other. The united front they had built to destroy me completely evaporated. Loretta immediately started making passive-aggressive comments about Spencer's failing company, implying he could not be trusted with a massive inheritance. Ebony retaliated by bringing up Desmond's horrible credit score and his history of terrible investments. They stood right there in the bedroom, fighting over the carcass of a woman who was perfectly healthy and actively manipulating them. They were so blinded by the $15 million that they became completely sloppy. They thought Grandma Ruby was just a fading old woman who spent her days drifting in and out of consciousness. They thought they could use her home as their personal staging ground to scheme and plot against one another. They began holding private hushed meetings in her oak-paneled home study, arguing over how to divide the assets the second her heart stopped beating. They calculated property values and discussed selling her antique collections while drinking her expensive bourbon. But my grandmother was 10 steps ahead of their greed. Before she even made the phone call to set the trap, she had brought in a private security firm. She had high-definition hidden cameras with motion sensors and crystal-clear audio recording devices installed in every single corner of her home study. She lay in her bed sipping chamomile tea and watching the live feed on her tablet. She was recording their every word, their every betrayal, and their true vicious colors. The glow of my encrypted tablet illuminated the dark nursery as I watched the live feed from Grandma Ruby's study. She had given me direct access to the security server, so we could monitor the trap together in real time. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The oak-paneled room remained completely empty, while the sounds of my family arguing over dinner echoed faintly through the walls. They were playing nice in front of Ruby, but the moment she requested to be left alone to rest, the true predatory nature of my family took over. It was just past midnight when the heavy brass handle of the study door slowly turned. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm as I leaned closer to the screen. Two figures slipped into the dark room and quietly closed the door behind them. It was my mother and Spencer. They did not turn on the main overhead light. Instead, Spencer reached over and switched on the small green glass banker's lamp on the desk, casting harsh shadows across their faces. The hidden camera mounted inside the smoke detector captured them in brilliant high definition, and the audio receivers picked up every single breath. They moved with a frantic, nervous energy. My mother pulled a thick manila folder from her oversized designer tote bag and spread the papers across Ruby's antique desk. Spencer pulled a specialized fountain pen from his breast pocket. I turned up the volume on my tablet, listening to the precise details of their malice. Loretta told Spencer they had to move quickly before Desmond or Ebony woke up. She whispered that they could not trust the others to handle something this delicate. My mother actually called her own husband and her golden child daughter liabilities. She spread a thick legal document across the blotter and tapped the bottom line. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. I listened in absolute horror as Spencer outlined the mechanics of their plot. His voice was cold and clinical. He explained that with this specific document, they would have complete legal authority over both Grandma Ruby and myself. He told my mother that the rumors Ebony had planted about my brain damage were the perfect foundation. He said once the signatures were in place, they would take the document straight to a judge. They would use my mother's testimony to declare me psychologically unfit and legally incompetent. Their plan was not just to steal my money. Spencer and my mother were actively conspiring to have me committed to an inpatient psychiatric facility against my will. They wanted to lock me away in a hospital, strip me of my rights, take my son, and drain every single penny of Ruby's $15 million estate into Spencer's failing corporate accounts to save his fake empire. My blood ran like ice water through my veins. This was my own mother, the woman who had carried me, the woman who had watched me grow up. She was standing in a dimly lit room, plotting to steal my freedom and my child just so she could maintain her country club lifestyle. I watched her hand Spencer a stack of old birthday cards and legal papers that Grandma Ruby and I had signed years ago. Spencer took the papers and carefully studied our handwriting. He leaned over the power of attorney document and took a slow, deep breath. The high-definition camera zoomed in perfectly as he began to forge my signature on the bottom line. He traced the loops of my name with practiced precision. When he finished, he moved to the next line and forged Grandma Ruby's signature, perfectly mimicking her shaky, elderly script. My mother stood over his shoulder, nodding in approval and patting his back. She told him he was the son she always wished she had. She told him they were going to be set for the rest of their lives. They carefully gathered the forged documents, slipped them back into the manila folder, and crept out of the study, leaving the room in total darkness once again. They thought they had just secured millions of dollars. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. They had no idea they had just committed multiple federal felonies on a crystal-clear video and audio recording. I did not waste a single second. I initiated a secure transfer and downloaded the entire block of high-definition footage directly to my encrypted offline servers. I made 3 separate backups and routed the primary file straight to a secure cloud drive that my legal team could access instantly. I had them. I had irrefutable, undeniable evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and forgery. There was no gaslighting their way out of this. There was no crying to a church congregation to gain sympathy. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to put them in prison. Just as the progress bar on the download reached 100%, my secondary phone began to ring. It was Julian calling from the private equity firm. He knew I was awake because we had been preparing for this exact moment for days. I answered the phone and his voice was crisp and strictly professional. He told me that the final legal hurdles had been completely cleared. The massive acquisition of Apex Solutions' toxic debt was officially closed and registered with the State Financial Board. Spencer's creditors had accepted the premium buyouts and signed over every single promissory note. Julian confirmed that my blind shell company was now the absolute legal owner of Spencer's entire corporate existence. The transition was finalized. The debt was mine. Julian asked me what my next directive was. He told me we had the legal authority to seize Spencer's assets, freeze his operating accounts, and padlock the doors to his Seattle headquarters by the time the sun came up. He asked if I wanted to issue a formal demand for immediate repayment, which would instantly force Apex Solutions into involuntary bankruptcy. I looked at the downloaded video file of Spencer forging my name to steal my life. I looked at the legal documents proving I now owned his. I told Julian to draft the bankruptcy filings, but to hold them until I gave the final signal. I did not want Spencer to get an email from a faceless creditor. I wanted to deliver the execution myself. The game was no longer about defending my sanity or protecting my child from their threats. The trap was fully loaded and the rats were sitting right on the spring. It was time to close the jaws. 2 days after the midnight forgery session, the digital invitations went out. Loretta and Spencer were so intoxicated by their perceived victory that they decided to turn their federal crime into a massive social event. My mother sent an urgent broadcast to our entire extended family, the megachurch congregation, and all of their wealthy friends in the Seattle area. She announced that they were hosting an extravagant early Thanksgiving dinner at Grandma Ruby's historic estate. The message claimed the gathering was a beautiful tribute to honor Ruby's final fading days and to pray for family healing. But Grandma Ruby and I were watching the hidden cameras, and we heard exactly what they were really planning. It was not a dinner party. It was a trap designed for maximum public humiliation. Loretta and Ebony stood in the kitchen sipping wine and gleefully discussing their masterpiece of a plan. My mother had actually contacted a private psychiatric transport service using the forged power of attorney as proof of her authority. They planned to wait until the mansion was packed with over 100 influential guests. Then Loretta was going to stand up and deliver a tearful speech about my tragic mental decline. She was going to present the fake documents to the crowd, declare me legally incompetent, and have the medical team march into the dining room to physically drag me away to a psychiatric ward. They wanted everyone to watch me scream and cry as I was hauled out the door, cementing the narrative that I was completely insane. Ebony even laughed and told Spencer that once I was locked in a padded room, she would petition the courts to take full custody of Deon so she could raise him in my house using my money. Hearing my sister casually plot to steal my infant son did not make me sad. It completely eradicated whatever tiny shred of familial mercy I had left in my soul. I spent the morning of the party preparing my arsenal. I called Julian at the private equity firm and gave him the green light. I told him to file the involuntary bankruptcy papers for Apex Solutions the second I gave the signal and to prepare the asset seizure teams. Then I sat at my desk and compiled the execution documents. I printed the bank statements proving Ebony had bled my parents dry. I printed the corporate debt acquisitions showing I owned Spencer completely. I printed the fake power of attorney that they had proudly emailed to the medical transport company. And finally, I printed 10 crystal clear glossy color photographs taken directly from the hidden camera footage showing Loretta and Spencer sitting in the dark study, explicitly forging my signature. I took every single piece of this radioactive evidence and secured it inside a thick, heavy red folder. I walked into my bathroom and looked at my reflection. My family had spent weeks telling the world that I was a broken, unhinged widow who could not even brush her own hair. They wanted a crazy woman, so I decided to give them an empress. I dressed in a perfectly tailored emerald green designer suit that fit me like armor. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, flawless knot at the nape of my neck. I applied my makeup with cold surgical precision, masking any trace of emotion. I wanted to look like a woman who owned the world, because financially speaking, I did. I went into the nursery and dressed my beautiful baby boy in a crisp white button-down shirt and a soft gray cardigan. We were not victims, and we were not going to be paraded around as their tragic charity case. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and orange, when I pulled my car through the heavy wrought iron gates of the estate. The sprawling circular driveway was completely packed with luxury vehicles. I could hear the loud hum of conversation, the clinking of crystal wine glasses, and the sound of a string quartet drifting from the massive backyard terrace. The entire family was out there feasting on catered food and eagerly waiting for the show to begin. They were waiting for the crazy widow to arrive so they could watch her be destroyed. I ignored the valet parking my car directly in front of the grand stone steps. I stepped out into the cool evening air, taking one deep, calming breath. I lifted Deon from his car seat and settled him securely against my left hip. In my right hand, I gripped the thick red folder that held their absolute ruin. I walked up the steps, pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors, and stepped into the grand foyer, ready to face my executioners. The heavy mahogany double doors clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the lion's den. The grand foyer and the adjoining living room were absolutely overflowing with guests. There were aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not seen in years mingling with dozens of my parents' wealthy country club friends. They were holding crystal champagne flutes and picking at expensive catered hors d'oeuvres, while a string quartet played softly in the background. The low hum of their cheerful chatter died instantly, the second they saw me standing there. Every single eye in the room locked onto my emerald green tailored suit and the thick red folder resting against my side. The silence was deafening. They were fully expecting a broken, unhinged woman in sweatpants ranting at the walls. Instead, they got a woman who looked ready to conquer a nation. My mother Loretta was the very first to break the heavy silence. She glided across the polished marble floor wearing a practiced look of deep maternal sorrow, but her eyes were darting nervously to the red folder in my hand. She stopped a few feet away, keeping her distance as if I were highly contagious. "Oh, Laila," she sighed loudly, making sure her voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings so everyone could hear her performance. "You actually came. We were so incredibly worried you would not be able to handle the drive in your current state of mind. You really should have let us send a private car for you and poor little Deon." Ebony materialized right next to her mother, holding a glass of sparkling water and wearing a smug, victorious smile that she did not even try to hide. She was dressed in a flashy designer gown that she had undoubtedly purchased using my stolen money. She looked me up and down, taking in my pristine suit and perfectly styled hair with a flicker of genuine irritation. "It is just a family dinner, Laila," Ebony drawled loudly, projecting her voice for the audience. "You did not need to dress up like you are going to a corporate board meeting. We just want you to be comfortable and safe. You know, with everything you are going through mentally, we just want to get you the help you so desperately need before you hurt yourself or your baby." The guests began murmuring to each other, exchanging pitying glances and shaking their heads in mock sorrow. My mother reached out, attempting to take Deon from my arms to complete her image as the rescuing grandmother. But I took a smooth, calculated step back. My face remained a mask of absolute calm. I held my son closer and smiled pleasantly at the women who were trying to destroy me. "I am perfectly fine, Mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly and steadily through the silent room. "I just came to deliver some highly important documents before the Thanksgiving dinner is served." That was Spencer's cue. He stepped out from the crowd, puffing out his chest and adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked around at the captive audience, soaking in their undivided attention before turning his condescending gaze on me. He reached up and patted the inner pocket of his suit jacket, exactly where I knew the forged power of attorney document was hiding. "Laila, we all love you very much," Spencer announced, adopting a grave, deeply serious tone. He projected his voice so the megachurch pastor standing near the fireplace could hear every single word. "But we have to be realistic about your rapidly declining mental health. This horrible tragedy has broken your mind, and as a family, we cannot just stand by and watch you destroy your life and your business." I have spent the last few days consulting with top medical professionals, and I have secured a spot for you at a highly exclusive inpatient mental health facility." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. My Aunt Patricia covered her mouth with her hand while several country club friends whispered in shock. Spencer pressed on clearly, loving the sound of his own voice and the power he thought he held over me. "You need professional psychiatric help, Laila." He continued, looking at me with fake pity. "The doctors are waiting outside right now to transport you safely to the clinic, but you do not need to worry about your company or your finances while you are locked away getting treatment. As your brother-in-law and a successful businessman, I am officially stepping up. I have the legal paperwork right here in my pocket, signed by you and your grandmother. I will be taking over the daily operations of your firm and managing your assets to ensure they are protected until you are completely cured." He practically beamed with pride as he delivered the final line. Ebony leaned her head against his shoulder, playing the supportive, loyal wife, while my mother dabbed her dry eyes with a cocktail napkin. They thought they had won the war. They thought announcing this hostile takeover in front of 100 people would force me to collapse in tears and surrender to their authority. They thought the immense public pressure and the threat of the medical transport waiting outside would break my spirit. They were expecting me to scream and fight so they could point at me and tell the crowd that I was acting crazy. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not try to defend my sanity to the room full of gaping spectators. I simply shifted Deon in my arms and looked directly past Spencer to the far side of the massive living room. My executive assistant Sarah had arrived an hour earlier under the guise of an event planner. She was standing quietly by the grand staircase, holding a small remote control in her hand. I caught Sarah's eye across the sea of silent guests and gave her a single sharp nod. She pressed the button on the remote. Instantly, the motorized blackout blinds unrolled over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the massive living room into sudden shadows. Before anyone could even voice their confusion, a massive projector hidden on the indoor balcony above sparked to life. A blinding beam of light cut through the dark room, casting a massive high-definition image directly onto the pristine white wall, right behind Spencer and my mother. The real war was about to begin. The projector hummed softly as it beamed a massive, crisp image onto the pristine white wall directly behind my mother and Spencer. The guests shielded their eyes for a second as the bright light washed over the room. But as the image came into perfect focus, the entire party fell into a stunned, breathless silence. It was a massive, highly detailed financial spreadsheet. At the very bottom of the screen in bold red numbers was a total of $735,000. I did not raise my voice, but in that dead quiet room, my words carried perfectly to every single person. I introduced the document as my 11-year ledger. I told the crowd to look closely at the screen because it documented every single penny I had spent keeping my parents and my sister from drowning in their own financial incompetence. I walked forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor, and pointed to the first column on the wall. It displayed the exact dates, banking routing numbers, and wire transfer confirmations, proving that I had personally paid off the final massive balloon payment on my parents' mortgage. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as the wealthy church members stared at Loretta in shock. Then I pointed to the second column. It clearly detailed the auto financing documents for Ebony's luxury vehicle. I explained to the crowd that the shiny car parked in the driveway right now was completely funded by my bank account because my sister refused to hold down a real job. My father, Desmond, tried to quietly slip toward the hallway, but I called his name out loud and directed everyone to the third column. It listed over $40,000 in delinquent golf club fees and quiet gambling debts. I told the room how Desmond had begged me crying on my porch to cover his debts so he would not be humiliated and kicked out of his prestigious country club. The gasps from his golfing buddies standing near the bar were loud and incredibly satisfying. I turned to Spencer, who was suddenly sweating profusely and patting the pocket where he hid the fake power of attorney. I told the crowd exactly what he and my mother were planning. I told them they had forged my signature in the middle of the night so they could have me dragged away to a psychiatric ward and steal my child. I explained that they did it because they thought Grandma Ruby and I were sitting on a massive liquid trust fund that they could easily drain to save Spencer's failing business. Then I delivered the ultimate truth. I looked my mother directly in the eye and told her there was no secret trust fund left for them to steal. I told them that my grandmother and I had already restructured every single asset and placed everything into ironclad blind trusts that they could never touch. They were completely cut off, and the Bank of Laila was permanently closed. The reaction from the party guests was instantaneous and brutal. The sympathetic smiles they had worn just moments before vanished entirely. The wealthy friends and megachurch members who had just been pitying my mental state suddenly turned their gazes on my parents. They looked at Loretta and Desmond with pure, unadulterated disgust. The grand illusion of the perfect wealthy Christian family completely shattered into a million pieces right there in the living room. They were exposed as greedy leeches who were willing to lock up their own flesh and blood just to keep funding their lavish lifestyle. People began whispering loudly, shaking their heads, and taking steps away from my parents as if they were infected with a disease. My mother absolutely lost her mind. She started screaming in frantic denial, waving her hands wildly in the air, and running back and forth trying to physically block the projector beam with her body. She yelled that the documents were fake, that I had doctored the bank statements, and that I was hallucinating. She kept screaming to the crowd that the brain damage had made me a pathological liar, and that this was exactly why I needed to be committed to a hospital immediately. But the bank routing numbers glowing on her own dress as she stood in front of the projector were undeniable. The crowd just stared at her pathetic performance in horrified silence. Ebony saw their social ruin happening in real time and panicked. She realized that defending their finances was a completely lost cause, so she went straight for the only weapon she thought she had left. She stepped forward, her face twisted in an ugly, desperate sneer. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was just a jealous, bitter widow making up lies for attention. She shouted that at least she was happily married to a successful CEO, while I was nothing but a miserable single mother who could not even keep a husband alive. The entire room gasped at the sheer unhinged cruelty of her words. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother stopped screaming, and Spencer puffed his chest out slightly, attempting to reclaim his stolen dignity, and looking down his nose at me. They expected me to crumble at the vicious insult to my dead husband and my status as a single mother. They expected tears of shame. Instead, I looked at Ebony, and I looked at the arrogant fake CEO standing beside her, and I threw my head back and laughed out loud. The beam of light cut through the dark living room and hit the pristine white wall directly behind my mother and Spencer. The massive high-definition image sharpened into perfect focus, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy guests. It was a highly detailed financial spreadsheet. At the very bottom of the screen in bold red text was a staggering total of $735,000. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I stepped forward, shifting my baby Deon to my other hip and keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. I introduced the document on the wall as my 11-year ledger. I told the audience of megachurch members and country club friends to look very closely at the screen, because it documented every single penny I had spent keeping my parents and my sister from completely drowning in their own financial incompetence. I walked them through the columns line by line while my family stood frozen in shock. I pointed to this first section, which displayed the exact dates, bank routing numbers, and wire transfer confirmations, proving that I had personally paid off the massive balloon payment on my parents' mortgage. I told the room that without my money, Loretta and Desmond would have lost this very estate years ago, and they would be living on the street. Several of my mother's wealthy friends gasped, covering their mouths and looking at her with wide eyes. Their whispers filled the room as they realized the woman who hosted their charity galas was secretly living off her daughter's grief. Then I pointed to the second column on the wall. It clearly detailed the auto financing documents for Ebony's luxury vehicle. I explained to the silent crowd that the shiny, expensive car parked in the driveway right now was completely funded by my bank account, because my sister refused to hold down a real job and expected me to subsidize her lavish lifestyle. I made sure everyone understood that Ebony had never earned a single dollar of her own, and that her entire socialite persona was built on my hard work. My father Desmond tried to quietly slip away toward the hallway to escape the humiliation, but I called his name out loud and directed everyone's attention to the third column. It listed over $40,000 in delinquent golf club fees and quiet gambling debts. I told the room how my father had shown up on my porch, begging and crying for me to cover his debts, so he would not be publicly humiliated and kicked out of his prestigious country club. The gasps from his golfing buddies standing near the bar were loud and incredibly satisfying. The grand illusion of the perfect wealthy Christian family was completely shattering into a million pieces right in front of their eyes. I turned my attention back to Spencer, who was suddenly sweating profusely. He kept nervously patting the pocket of his suit jacket, where he was hiding the fake power of attorney. I told the crowd exactly what he and my mother were really planning tonight. I exposed their midnight forgery session in the study. I told everyone how they had forged my signature so they could have me dragged away to a psychiatric ward and steal my infant son. I explained that they were doing all of this because they believed Grandma Ruby and I were sitting on a massive liquid trust fund that they could easily drain to save Spencer's failing business. Then I delivered the ultimate truth. I looked my mother directly in the eye and told her there was no secret trust fund left for them to steal. I stated clearly that my grandmother and I had already restructured every single asset and placed everything into ironclad blind trusts that they could never touch. I told them they were completely cut off, and the Bank of Laila was permanently closed. The reaction from the party guests was instantaneous and brutal. The sympathetic smiles they had worn just moments before vanished entirely. They turned their gazes on my parents with pure, unadulterated disgust. They realized they were looking at greedy leeches who were willing to lock up their own flesh and blood just to keep funding their lavish lifestyle. People began whispering loudly, shaking their heads, and taking physical steps away from my parents as if they were infected with a terrible disease. My mother absolutely lost her mind. She started screaming in frantic denial, waving her hands wildly in the air. She ran back and forth, trying to physically block the projector beam with her own body. She yelled that the documents were fake, that I had doctored the bank statements, and that I was hallucinating. She kept screaming to the crowd that the tragedy had made me a pathological liar, and that this was exactly why I needed to be committed to a hospital immediately. But the bank routing numbers glowing across her own designer dress as she stood in front of the projector were entirely undeniable. The crowd just stared at her pathetic performance in horrified silence. Ebony saw their social ruin happening in real time and completely panicked. She realized that defending their finances was a lost cause, so she went straight for the only weapon she thought she had left. She stepped forward, her face twisted in an ugly, desperate sneer. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was just a jealous, bitter widow making up lies for attention. She shouted that at least she was happily married to a successful CEO, unlike me, a miserable single mother who could not even keep a husband alive. The entire room gasped at the sheer unhinged cruelty of her words. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother stopped screaming, and Spencer puffed his chest out slightly, attempting to reclaim his stolen dignity while looking down his nose at me. They expected me to crumble at the vicious insult to my dead husband and my status as a single mother. They expected tears of shame and a total breakdown. Instead, I looked at Ebony and I looked at her arrogant fake CEO husband, and I threw my head back and laughed out loud. My genuine echoing laughter filled the massive living room, silencing everyone. It was a deep, full laugh that carried all the weight of my newfound power. I stopped laughing and my face went stone cold. I walked over to the grand dining table and slammed the thick red folder down onto the mahogany surface. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, making several guests physically jump. I looked Spencer dead in the eye and told the crowd that Ebony's successful CEO husband was actually a massive fraud. I opened the red folder and pulled out the verified financial records. I passed them to the closest investors in the room. I exposed the massive toxic debt his company Apex Solutions was hiding from everyone. I laid out the concrete proof of his ongoing investor fraud, detailing how he had been moving money around to hide his impending bankruptcy and using fake projections to secure loans he could never repay. Spencer's face completely drained of all color. His arrogant posture collapsed, and he looked like a terrified child caught in a lie. The guests who had previously admired him now stared in absolute shock as the documents were passed around, proving his complete financial ruin. Then I pulled out the final stack of legally binding buyout documents. I held them up for everyone to see. I explained that my blind shell company had spent the last week quietly purchasing every single piece of his toxic debt from his desperate creditors. I told him that the massive acquisition was completely finalized and registered with the state. I was now his primary creditor. I owned his entire corporate existence, and I held every single note on his failing empire. There was no escape, and no legal loophole he could use to get out of this trap. I looked at him with absolute coldness, and my voice rang clear across the dead silent room. I told him, I am officially freezing your assets, Spencer. You are not a CEO, you are bankrupt. The color rushed out of Ebony's face. She stood there paralyzed, staring at her husband in absolute horror as the reality of their complete destruction finally set in. She realized that the lavish life she had been bragging about was entirely fake, and that the sister she had just viciously insulted was now the absolute owner of her entire future. The silence in the room was suffocating as Ebony just stared at Spencer. You could physically see the gears turning in her head as she processed the absolute magnitude of her ruin. The designer dress she was wearing, the luxury car parked outside the mansion, the lavish life she lived, none of it belonged to them. It was all a fragile house of cards, built on toxic debt and fraudulent loans. The man she had paraded around high society as her ultimate prize was nothing but a broke, desperate con artist who had been using my money to keep himself afloat. The sheer humiliation of it all was too much for her fragile, narcissistic ego to bear. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She dropped her glass of sparkling water, letting it shatter into jagged pieces on the polished marble floor. She lunged at Spencer, her arms swinging in a wide, brutal arc. The sound of her open hand slapping him across the face echoed through the massive living room like a gunshot. The country club wives gasped and stepped back, clutching their pearls. The mega-church pastor looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Ebony did not care who was watching anymore. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, calling Spencer a worthless, gold-digging fraud. She shrieked that he had ruined her life, that he had humiliated her in front of the entire city, and that he was nothing but a pathetic loser who had used her family for status. She beat her fists against his chest, crying hysterically about how she was going to be the absolute laughingstock of Seattle. Spencer stumbled back, his cheek glowing bright red from the slap. For a second he looked shocked, but that shock quickly morphed into vicious venom. He grabbed her wrists and pushed her away, screaming right back in her face. He told her she was a delusional, spoiled brat, and that her insane spending habits were the exact reason his company went under in the first place. He shouted for the entire room to hear about her $100,000 shopping sprees, her useless vanity projects, the absurd luxury vacations she demanded, and the ridiculous cars he had to lease just to keep up her fake socialite appearances. He blamed her greedy, bottomless appetite for luxury for bleeding his corporate accounts completely dry. He yelled that he only married her because he thought my parents had deep pockets, and he laughed bitterly, telling her that her family was just as broke and pathetic as he was. My mother Loretta let out a horrified shriek. She rushed forward, trying to physically wedge herself between them. She grabbed Ebony's arm, begging her to lower her voice and stop making a scene in front of their wealthy friends. My father Desmond stomped over, grabbing Spencer by the collar of his suit jacket and threatening to throw him out of the house. But the pressure cooker had exploded, and there was no putting the lid back on. Desmond turned his anger on Loretta, blaming her for raising an entitled monster and draining their own retirement savings to fund Ebony's fake lifestyle. Loretta snapped, instantly turning on her husband with vicious ferocity. She screamed that if Desmond had not lost tens of thousands of dollars, secretly gambling and trying to impress his arrogant friends at the golf course, they would not be in this mess. She called him a weak man who could not even provide for his own wife. The four of them stood in the middle of the grand living room, completely abandoning any pretense of class or dignity. They tore into each other like starving animals fighting over a scrap of meat. They hurled decades of jealousy and bitter financial secrets at each other, while the projector behind them continued to illuminate the wall with the cold, hard math of their failure. The wealthy guests whom my parents had invited to witness my tragic mental collapse were now standing paralyzed, watching the total implosion of the perfect Christian family. People were backing away, whispering to each other, covering their mouths in absolute horror. Some of the younger guests were even pulling out their phones to record the screaming match. The facade was dead and buried. I stood there perfectly calm, holding my baby boy against my hip and watching them destroy themselves. Spencer was sweating heavily now. He was panting, his hair a messy mop sticking to his forehead. He looked around at the crowd and realized that people were laughing at him. He realized that he was entirely cornered and that the reality of federal prison and absolute bankruptcy was closing in on him fast. His eyes darted wildly around the room until they finally locked onto me. Pure, desperate madness flashed in his eyes. He realized that arguing with Ebony was useless, and that he had one final card to play. He reached into his jacket pocket with a violently shaking hand and ripped out the manila envelope. He pulled out the forged, durable power of attorney and waved it high in the air like a weapon. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding that everyone shut up and stop looking at him. His voice cracked with panic as he pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He shouted that nothing I said mattered because I was legally incompetent. He yelled that he had the official paperwork right here, signed and notarized, giving him total legal control over my life, my company, and my assets. He screamed that the medical transport team was waiting right outside the gates, and that they were going to haul me away in a straitjacket because I was completely insane and a danger to my child. He clutched the fake document to his chest, roaring over the murmurs of the crowd that he was in charge of everything now and that my money belonged to him. Spencer stood in the center of the massive living room, panting heavily with his chest heaving up and down. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He held the forged manila envelope high in the air, gripping the fake power of attorney document so tightly that his knuckles were turning completely white. He was screaming over the murmurs of the stunned crowd, desperately trying to convince the wealthy guests and the megachurch pastor that he was the hero of this story. He shouted that the paper in his hand gave him total legal control over my life, my company, and my child. He yelled that I was mentally unstable and unfit to be a mother or a business owner. He kept pointing his trembling finger at me, demanding that everyone look at the official notary seal on the bottom of the page. He thought that piece of paper was his ultimate shield. He thought it was his golden ticket to steal my entire life and save himself from federal prison and absolute bankruptcy. Ebony was still sobbing on the floor, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Loretta and my father Desmond had paused their vicious screaming match to stare at Spencer. For a fleeting second, a look of desperate hope flashed across my mother's face. She actually thought Spencer's forged document might save them from total social and financial ruin. The party guests were entirely silent, shifting uncomfortably, and looking back and forth between me and the frantic fake CEO holding the paperwork. They were waiting to see if I would finally break down and surrender to his authority. They expected me to panic or try to snatch the document out of his hands. I did absolutely nothing. I simply held my baby Deon closer to my chest and kept my face completely devoid of any emotion. I let Spencer soak in his false sense of victory for just a few more seconds. The suffocating silence in the room was suddenly broken by a very distinct sound. It was the sharp mechanical squeak of the brakes on a wheelchair. Every single head in the room instantly turned toward the dark corner near the grand fireplace. Grandma Ruby had been sitting there the entire evening. She had been completely motionless, blending into the shadows while my family tore each other apart like wild animals. My mother Loretta gasped and took a nervous step back. Spencer froze his arms, still suspended in the air, holding the fake document. Grandma Ruby did not say a word at first. She placed her hands firmly on the armrests of her leather wheelchair. Then slowly, and with immense deliberate purpose, she pushed herself up. My mother let out a small, terrified whimper because she knew exactly what this meant. For months, Loretta had been telling everyone that Grandma Ruby was too frail to stand and too confused to understand her own finances. But Grandma Ruby did not look frail or confused. She looked like a towering matriarch who was completely fed up with the pathetic greed of her own daughter. She stood tall and straight, smoothing down the front of her elegant dark dress. The crowd watched in absolute awe as this woman who was supposed to be helpless walked forward with steady, confident steps. She moved right past my cowering mother and stopped right next to me. She looked at Spencer with an expression of pure, icy contempt. Grandma Ruby did not even bother addressing Spencer directly. Instead, she looked across the room and locked eyes with my executive assistant Sarah, who was still standing by the grand staircase, holding the projector remote. Grandma Ruby gave Sarah a single sharp nod. Sarah immediately pressed a button on the small device. The massive financial spreadsheet that had been exposing my parents' debts vanished from the white wall. The room plunged into near darkness for a split second, causing the guests to murmur in confusion. Then the projector whirred slightly louder, and a brand new image filled the entire wall. It was a video feed. The picture was in incredibly crisp, high-definition color night vision. The timestamp flashing in the bottom right corner of the screen showed that the footage was recorded at exactly 2:14 in the morning just 2 nights ago. The camera angle provided a perfect wide view of my father's private study in this very house. The crowd immediately recognized the heavy oak desk and the distinctive leather chairs. Then they saw the subjects of the video. My mother Loretta and my brother-in-law Spencer were creeping into the study, looking over their shoulders like common thieves. A collective gasp erupted from the party guests as they watched the wealthy socialite and the arrogant CEO sneaking around in the dark. The hidden camera had captured flawless audio. The entire living room could hear my mother whispering frantically on the screen. Her voice echoed off the walls as she complained to Spencer about how risky this was. The crowd listened in absolute horror as the recorded version of Loretta explicitly admitted that she had stolen a notary stamp from her former employer years ago and kept it hidden for an emergency, exactly like this one. They heard her beg Spencer to make sure the signature looked authentic, because if the bank rejected the paperwork, they would lose their chance to drain my accounts. The video showed Spencer laughing arrogantly. The sound of his recorded laughter sent a shiver of disgust through the real-life crowd watching the wall. On the screen, Spencer told my mother to calm down and stop acting like a coward. He explicitly bragged that I was too completely broken by my husband's death to ever notice someone taking over my company. The guests turned to look at the real Spencer, who was now standing completely paralyzed in the middle of the room. The fake power of attorney document was still gripped in his hand, but it was shaking so violently that the paper was making a loud rustling noise. The footage on the wall zoomed in slightly. The hidden camera captured Spencer pulling a scrap piece of paper from his pocket. The entire room watched in high definition as he spent 2 full minutes practicing my signature over and over again. They heard him muttering to himself, trying to get the loop of the letter L exactly right. Then the undeniable moment arrived. The video showed Spencer pulling the official blank power of attorney form out of a manila envelope. He leaned over my father's oak desk, took a black pen, and forged my signature directly onto the legal document. As soon as he finished, my mother stepped forward. The camera clearly caught Loretta pulling the stolen heavy metal notary stamp out of her silk robe pocket. She slammed the stamp down onto the bottom of the forged page, making it look like a legally binding document. They were caught on crystal-clear video, committing multiple severe felonies. They were caught conspiring to steal my child and my entire fortune while mocking my grief over my dead husband. There was absolutely no room for interpretation. There was no possible way to spin this as a misunderstanding or a family disagreement. It was hard, undeniable criminal fraud broadcasted 10 feet tall for their entire social circle to witness. The wealthy friends, the business partners, and the church members stared at the wall in pure, horrified revulsion. The silence in the room was heavier than before, thick with judgment and absolute disgust. People began whispering fiercely to one another, stepping even further away from my family, as if being near them would somehow make them complicit in the crimes. Spencer finally dropped his arm. His fingers went limp, and the forged power of attorney document fluttered from his hand and landed on the polished marble floor. He looked like he was going to vomit. My mother Loretta let out a guttural sobbing wail and literally collapsed onto her knees. She hid her face in her hands, rocking back and forth on the floor as the video of her committing fraud looped again on the wall behind her. Ebony just stared blankly at the screen, her mind completely unable to process the fact that she was going to be the wife of a convicted felon. My father Desmond looked at his wife on the floor and slowly backed away, trying to distance himself from the toxic fallout. Grandma Ruby took one slow step forward. The entire room instantly fell silent, eager to hear what the matriarch of the family had to say. She looked down at Loretta and Spencer writhing in their own humiliation on the marble floor. She did not raise her voice, but every word she spoke was laced with cold, lethal authority. She announced to the room that she and I had known about their greedy intentions for months. She explained that we had hired private security to install hidden cameras in every corner of the estate, the moment we suspected they were planning something sinister. My mother looked up through her tears, her makeup completely ruined. She reached a shaking hand toward Grandma Ruby, begging her for mercy. She cried out that they could keep this in the family, that they could tear up the document, and just forget the whole thing ever happened. She pleaded that she was her daughter, and that public exposure would ruin their lives forever. Grandma Ruby just stared down at her with absolutely zero pity. She coldly declared that they were no longer her family. She told the terrified pair on the floor that she did not just keep the video footage to show off at a dinner party. She raised her chin and announced clearly to the silent room that she had personally handed the unedited security footage, the financial spreadsheets, and the evidence of the stolen notary stamp directly over to the local police department hours ago. The remaining color drained entirely from Spencer's face. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a side table and gasping for air. My mother started hyperventilating, clutching at her chest as total panic set in. The party guests began murmuring in alarm, realizing that this was no longer just a family dispute, but an active criminal investigation. The heavy, suffocating silence of the grand living room was suddenly broken by a sharp, piercing sound coming from outside the tall mansion windows. It was a low, mechanical wailing sound that cut through the night air, growing steadily louder and louder by the second. The red and blue flashing lights began to reflect off the glass windows as the unmistakable shriek of approaching police sirens surrounded the entire estate. The piercing wail of the police sirens tore through the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand living room. The flashing red and blue lights pulsed rapidly through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the horrified faces of the wealthy party guests. Spencer let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp and dropped the forged power of attorney document, as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished marble floor, and knocked over a tall crystal vase that shattered into 100 jagged pieces. My mother Loretta let out a guttural, animalistic scream and curled into a tight ball on the ground, covering her ears as the sirens grew deafeningly loud. Heavy boots pounded against the front stone steps, and the grand mahogany double doors burst open with explosive force. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives marched straight into the grand foyer. They did not pause to ask questions or assess the situation, because Grandma Ruby had already provided them with the unedited night vision security footage, the detailed financial spreadsheets, and the physical evidence of the stolen notary stamp. They knew exactly who they were looking for, and they knew exactly what crimes had been committed. The lead detective bypassed the terrified catering staff and walked directly up to Spencer, who was now trembling uncontrollably by the dining table. The detective did not politely read him his rights or pull him aside to save his dignity in front of his peers. He grabbed Spencer's arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and slammed him chest first against the solid mahogany wood. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the terrified whispers of the captive crowd. Spencer completely broke down. He started crying, instantly sobbing and begging the officers to listen to him. He turned his head and screamed that it was all my mother's idea, and that she had forced him to forge my signature under extreme duress. He threw his own mother-in-law under the bus without a single second of hesitation, just to save his own skin. Loretta scrambled backward on the floor, her expensive designer gown bunching up around her knees as two stern officers approached her. My father Desmond saw the police moving in and practically leapt out of the way. He held his hands up in the air and loudly declared to the detectives and the entire room that he had absolutely nothing to do with the midnight forgery and that his wife had acted completely alone. Loretta screamed at him, her face twisted in absolute betrayal, calling him a weak, pathetic coward, as the officers hauled her roughly to her feet and clamped the heavy cuffs around her wrists. Ebony stood frozen by the grand fireplace, completely paralyzed, watching her fake CEO husband and her scheming mother being arrested for felony fraud. She knew in that exact moment that her lavish fake life was entirely over, and she would be left with absolutely nothing. As the officers began to drag my thrashing mother and weeping brother-in-law toward the front doors, Grandma Ruby raised her hand. Her voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable lethal authority that made even the seasoned police detectives stop exactly where they stood. "Wait just a moment," she commanded, pointing a long, steady finger at my mother. "Before you take them down to a concrete holding cell, I want them to hear exactly what their disgusting greed has cost them tonight." Grandma Ruby took another step forward, looking down at the pathetic figures of Loretta and Spencer. The entire room held its collective breath. The megachurch pastor was silently inching toward the exit, and the wealthy country club friends were staring with wide, unblinking eyes, unable to look away from the spectacular ruin of the Wilson family. Grandma Ruby looked directly at my mother, whose face was now a terrible mess of smeared black mascara and tears of pure panic. She told Loretta that she had spent her entire adult life chasing fake social status and treating her youngest daughter like an unwanted burden. She told her that tonight she had finally crossed a line of pure evil that could never ever be uncrossed. Grandma Ruby announced to the dead silent room that she had visited her private attorney's office 3 days ago. She explained that she had completely dissolved her previous will, the exact document that my greedy family had been so desperately plotting to steal. She looked at my father Desmond, who was sweating and wiping his forehead with a cocktail napkin. She looked at Ebony, who was trembling and staring blankly at the floor. Grandma Ruby stated clearly and deliberately that her total estate, including the liquid banking assets, the vast real estate portfolios, and the highly lucrative offshore investments, was currently valued at exactly $15 million. The crowd let out a massive collective gasp at the sheer staggering magnitude of the hidden wealth. My mother's eyes bulged in absolute shock, because despite all her scheming, she had never realized just how much money was truly at stake. Then Grandma Ruby delivered the final crushing blow. She declared with absolute finality that not a single penny of that $15 million fortune would ever go to Loretta Desmond or Ebony. She told them they were completely and permanently disinherited, cut out of the family legacy forever, without any legal recourse or ability to ever contest the decision in court. She watched the absolute despair wash over their faces and smiled a cold, satisfied smile. Grandma Ruby continued, her voice ringing with absolute triumph. She explained that the first significant portion of the massive estate was being immediately donated to a national charity dedicated to empowering and educating young African American women. The remaining millions, she announced, looking directly at me, were already placed into an ironclad, bulletproof blind trust solely in the name of her great-grandson Deon. She told the entire room of gaping guests that Laila was the sole legal trustee of that massive fortune. I was in complete, untouchable control of the immense wealth they had just ruined their lives trying to steal. My mother let out a horrific, agonizing scream of pure, total defeat, As the officers finally dragged her kicking and thrashing out the front doors into the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers waiting in the driveway. The heavy oak doors of the mansion burst open with such violent force that they slammed against the interior walls. The sharp sound echoed over the wailing sirens as a half-dozen police officers swarmed into the grand living room. Their heavy boots pounded against the polished marble floor, cutting right through the crowd of terrified party guests. The officers marched straight toward the center of the room, moving to surround Spencer and my mother. But before the police could even pull out their steel handcuffs, Grandma Ruby raised her hand high in the air. Her sudden movement commanded absolute silence from everyone in the room, including the armed detectives. She looked directly at the trembling forms of Loretta Desmond and Ebony, and announced that there was one final piece of business to handle before they were taken away. Grandma Ruby stood tall and addressed the entire silent room. She revealed that she had secretly visited her attorney's office 3 days ago to finalize her actual last will and testament. She looked my mother right in the eye and stated with absolute lethal clarity that her total estate was currently valued at exactly $15 million. The massive crowd of wealthy socialites let out a collective gasp at the staggering sum. My mother's eyes bulged in complete disbelief, having never realized just how much wealth was truly sitting right in front of her. Grandma Ruby smiled a cold, satisfied smile and declared that not a single penny of that massive fortune would ever go to Loretta Desmond or Ebony. She told them they were entirely cut out of the family legacy and would get absolutely nothing. The room remained dead silent as Grandma Ruby continued explaining exactly where her $15 million estate would go. She announced that a massive initial donation was already designated for a national charity dedicated to supporting and empowering young African American women. As for the remaining millions, she declared that every last dime had been placed into an ironclad bulletproof trust fund exclusively for her great-grandson, Deon. She looked across the room at me and loudly proclaimed that Laila was named as the sole legal trustee. I was in complete, untouchable control of the immense wealth they had just ruined their lives trying to steal. My mother let out a horrific, agonizing scream of pure total defeat as the weight of her monumental failure finally crushed her. With the truth fully revealed, the police officers did not hesitate any longer. 2 officers grabbed Spencer by his shoulders, spinning him around and slamming him forcefully against the dining table. The loud metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like a gunshot. Spencer began to thrash and whine like a cornered animal, his previous arrogance completely evaporating. He cried out that it was a terrible mistake, screaming that it was all Loretta's idea and that she had forced him to forge the documents. He betrayed his mother-in-law without a single second of hesitation just to save his own skin. But the officers simply ignored his pathetic rambling and dragged him toward the exit. His expensive shoes scraped uselessly across the floor as they hauled him out into the flashing lights. As Spencer disappeared through the front doors, my mother completely broke down. Loretta's legs gave out beneath her entirely, and she dropped heavily onto her knees, her expensive designer gown bunching up around her on the cold marble floor. She crawled across the ground toward me, leaving a trail of smeared makeup and broken dignity. She reached out with violently trembling hands and grasped the fabric of my dress, clutching it as if it were a life raft. She looked up at me with wild, terrified eyes and started begging hysterically. She pleaded with me to pay her bail, crying out that I controlled millions of dollars now and could make all of this go away. She sobbed that she was my mother and that I could not just abandon the family. She swore she would change, promising to do whatever I wanted if I just kept her out of a federal prison cell. My father Desmond did not try to help her up or defend her. He stood several feet away, hanging his head down in utter shame. He could not even bring himself to look me in the eye. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his own passive cowardice. For decades he had stood by silently while his wife abused me to protect his comfortable fake life, and now that silence had cost him absolutely everything. Across the room, Ebony stood perfectly paralyzed like a mannequin carved out of pure terror. Her mouth hung slightly open, but she could not speak. The sister who had relentlessly mocked my grief and paraded around in stolen luxury was now facing total annihilation. She watched her fraudulent husband get dragged away, realizing she had absolutely no real skills, no real money, and now no future. She was trapped in her own nightmare, completely ruined. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, holding my baby boy Deon safely against my chest. He was resting peacefully, unaffected by the screaming and the flashing police lights. I looked down at Loretta, who was still gripping my dress and sobbing into the fabric. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of anger or sadness or pity, but there was nothing left. My eyes were completely devoid of any emotion as I stared down at the woman who had conspired to destroy me. I gently but firmly took hold of her trembling wrists and pulled my dress out of her desperate grasp. I took a deliberate step backward, breaking the physical and emotional connection between us forever. I looked deep into her panicked, tear-filled eyes, and I spoke with a voice as calm and smooth as a frozen lake. I repeated the exact words she had said to me when I was drowning in the darkest pain of my life. I said, "Don't make a big deal out of it, Mom. Enjoy your Caribbean cruise." Loretta's face went completely slack as the devastating weight of those words hit her. The finality in my voice confirmed what she had feared the most. She was entirely on her own. I turned my back on her kneeling form and walked over to Grandma Ruby, who was watching the scene with quiet, profound satisfaction. I adjusted Deon securely in my arms and linked my free arm gently through Grandma Ruby's arm. The two of us turned toward the grand entrance, walking forward together with our heads held high. The sea of wealthy party guests silently parted for us, stepping aside with absolute respect to let us pass. We walked out the front doors, leaving the screaming and the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars far behind us. A sleek black limousine was waiting at the end of the circular driveway, its engine purring softly in the cool, peaceful night air. We climbed into the plush, quiet interior of the car, settling into the comfortable leather seats. The doors closed, shutting out the noise of the estate completely. The limousine slowly pulled away, gliding smoothly down the long driveway and disappearing into the darkness, leaving the toxic family to their complete and utter ruin. The ultimate lesson here is that toxic behavior and relentless greed will always orchestrate their own downfall. For years, Loretta and Spencer believed they could manipulate and abuse Laila without ever facing the consequences. They mistook her quiet endurance for weakness and assumed their status would forever shield them from the truth. However, true power does not come from forged documents or fake wealth. It comes from absolute integrity and resilience. When you treat family as disposable pawns for your own selfish gain, the universe has a way of stripping away everything you value most. The darkness you inflict on others will eventually become the exact trap that ruins you. If this story of ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic tales of survival.